Welcome to History of Costume. In this course, we will review the different periods of costume and the events that led to changes in dress. Our dress is an outward expression of who we are. A person can learn a lot about us, our society, and our cultural norms simply by how we dress. Why do we wear clothes? For protection? Yes. For modesty? Yes. For decoration? Uh huh. And for status? You got it. Clothing is used to protect the body from the elements. It is necessary for survival as it provides protection from the heat and the cold. Protection can also be in the form of the supernatural. In most cultures, dress is used to identify status. Often the upper class versus the lower class, the executive versus the blue collar worker, can easily be distinguished based upon dress. Every society has its own take on what is considered modest. What's modest in one area of the world may be viewed as immodest in another. Although the aforementioned are motivations for dress, our primary motivation is decoration. We want to decorate ourselves to look fashionable. The social purpose of dress. In most societies, dress is used to distinguish men from women. However, there is no universal custom that exists. In other words, there is no particular form of dress for men and women that is worldwide. In the earlier years in Western Europe and North America, where Europeans settled, boys and girls were dressed alike. However, as they grew older, their dress would change, marking their age. Particular styles of dress and uniforms designate occupational, marital, or socioeconomic status. Doctors are known to wear white coats. Nurses used to be known for wearing a white shirt, skirt, stockings, shoes, and hat. Rings are worn on the left hand ring finger, symbolizing marriage. Chanel clothing denotes upper class. Dress can identify one as belonging to a certain group, whether that is a religious group or a social group, such as a fraternity or a sorority. For example, in the Muslim religion, hijabs are worn. With fraternities and sororities, these groups identify by the branding through the jackets that they wear to the colors of the garments that they wear. Forms of dress also designate ceremonial events such as baptisms, mourning, or quinceañeras. In the Christian faith, when someone is baptized, they wear all white. When someone is in mourning, they typically wear all black. With the quince, the girl who turns 15 normally wears a very elaborate dress. All right, so part one, the ancient Middle East. Circa 3500 before Common Era to 600 Common Era. Western civilization began around the Mediterranean Sea. It was here that artistic, religious, philosophical, and political basis of the Western culture formed. As a result of cultures borrowing from each other, basic garments can be found amongst many of the Mediterranean cultures, though this is not to say that they did not have their own distinctive forms of dress. Most clothing was draped, providing more comfort due to its loose fit in warm climates than fitted clothing. A draped garment consisted of a draped length of fabric that is either square, rectangular, or semicircular. They can be further subdivided into loincloths, skirts, tunics, shawls, cloaks, and veils. So here's a few terms. Loincloth. It's a length of cloth wrapped to cover the genitals. A skirt, which began at the waist or slightly below and hung loose around the body. Tunics were one piece, T-shaped garments with openings for the head and the arms. Shawls were rectangle, square, or oval pieces of fabric. A cloak was a large square of fabric tied or pinned at the neck. A veil is a rectangle smaller than a shawl or cloak and that is worn over the head. A fibula is a pin used to hold a garment together. Mesopotamian civilization. The first Mesopotamian civilization was established at Sumer, home of the Samaritans. The main products of Mesopotamia were barley, wool, and oil. Wool was used for trade and domestic consumption. Although flax, the source of linen fiber, can be found in historic records, the importance of wool was more than that of linen. Mesopotamia lacked natural barriers to invasion, and foreign invaders entered periodically with new ideas, including forms of dress, which were then incorporated into the culture. Costume components for men and women. Skirts were the major item of dress for both men and women. They were composed of sheepskin. They came in various lengths and were wrapped around the body. The hair was typically worn shaven. Men in particular were clean shaven, but they did have beards. Shaven heads discourages vermin. If a woman had long hair, she would often pull it into a bun, referred to as a chignon. Elaborate gold jewelry was also worn. Costume of later Sumerians and Babylonians, circa 2500 through 1000 before Common Era. During this period, increased distinctions were made between men and women dress. Although style evolved slowly, dress began to be increasingly complex. Costume components for men. The most common items of dress for the poor were skirts, loincloths, and tunics, while the noble wore draped garments. As previously mentioned, men's heads were shaven. They only wore beards. They also wore turban-style hats, which were worn closely fitted with a small brim or padded roll at the edge. Men often went barefoot or wore sandals. However, sandals seem to only be reserved for ceremonial functions. Costume for specialized occupations. Soldiers' dress consisted of skirts made of woven fabric with a fringed edge. Shawls were worn with skirts. Across the left shoulder was the center of the shawl, with each end crossing the chest and carried back and knotted over the right hip. The soldiers' helmets were made of metal or leather. Sandals were worn when necessary due to rough terrain. Costume components for women. Comb knockers remained popular amongst women, but gradually became associated with religious figures such as goddesses or priestesses. During this time, garments were cut to cover the entire body, most likely with the design of choice being a skirt combination that consisted of a short cape with an opening for the head or a tunic with opening for the head and arms. It is believed that costume was draped from a rectangular piece of fabric or a rectangle with one curved end. Hair was worn in a chignon with a fillet to keep the hair in place. Women wore tightly fitted necklaces that were similar to a dog's collar. The necklace was created using several rings of metal. Costume of later Mesopotamians, later Babylonians, and the Assyrians, circa 1000 to 600 before Common Era. During this period, the Assyrians adopted the Babylonian costume. Hence, there is not a clear distinction between the styles. The Assyrians did add their own decoration to the Babylonian styles. The costumes of the king and the chief officials had woven or embroidered patterns on them. Costume components for men. Tunics were an essential part of dress. Made of linen, they were worn as an underlayer to serve as a buffer between the skin and wool garments, preventing the irritation that wool causes to the skin. Variations in cut, construction, and fit in length and whether they had sleeves and the length of the sleeves depended on the different civilizations. Floor-length tunics were reserved for royalty to wear on special occasions. The tunic was worn underneath several fringed shawls, draped around the body in a complex manner, restricting movement. The everyday attire for royalty was most likely simpler. Royalty was identified by differences in style, materials, and the elaborateness of decoration or by emblems of power. Men were bearded with the hair arranged in small curls. The king wore his beard longer than those of other men, while the lower class men wore shorter hair and beards. High brimless hats, similar to the fez or tarnish, were worn. This hat was depicted as having broad bands of fabric hanging down the back. The king's hat, similar to that of the 20th century Eastern Orthodox Christian priest, was higher and straighter than the men's hat. Sandals were worn. Depending on their use, the soles were either thick or thin. Jewelry worn consisted of earrings, bracelets, armlets, having decorative motifs that mimicked those seen on the fabrics. Costumes for specialized occupations. Soldiers wore a short tunic, a corselet of mail made of small metal plates sewn onto leather or heavy cloth, and a wide belt. Helmets came to a peak at the back of the head and had a close fit. Sandals and high boots were also worn. Costume components for women. Women tunics were made of elaborately patterned fabrics with sleeves longer than those of men. Fringed shawls were also worn. Veils were a distinguishing mark of a free, married woman. They covered the woman's face in public. Even today, in certain parts of the world, this practice remains. Underneath the veil, their hair was styled in various ways, from elaborate in the earlier times for the Assyrian women to simplified curly shoulder-length hair in later times. Egyptian civilization. While Mesopotamian civilization was developing, so was Egyptian civilization. Egypt was less open to invasion and outside influence, continuity in political and religious tradition. The social structure. The Egyptian hierarchy consisted of the pharaoh at the top of the pyramid, his chief deputies and high priests on the second level, and then on the bottom level were all the officials. The upper and lower classes were distinguished by the elements of the garment that they wore, such as the draping, the quality of the fabrics, the addition of expensive jewelry and belts. Grooming practices also distinguished the upper from the lower classes, as the upper class was expected to adhere to higher standards of grooming. Egyptian motifs. Egyptians believed that representing religious figures in the form of symbols in jewelry would pass along the positive qualities to the wearer. Gold jewelry was a prized possession for Egyptians. Religious symbols or Egyptian motifs often appeared on jewelry. The scarab is a symbol of a beetle, representing the sun god and rebirth. The uraeus is a sacred cobra, the symbol of Lower Egypt. The vulture is a symbol of Upper Egypt. Together, they symbolize unification. The Eye of Horus is a representation of the human eye. It symbolizes the moon. Egyptian costume circa 3000 to 300 before Common Era. Garments were simplistic for all ages and classes. There was minimal sewing or construction that was needed. Very few garments had seams. The quality of the material used, as well as the amount of clothing a person owned, would denote their class. Costume components for men. Linen loincloths were worn as under or outer garments. Typically, loincloths were the sole garments worn by laborers. Aprons were separate items worn to cover the genital area. They were worn alone over a skirt, over a loincloth, or over some other garment, and underneath a skirt. Made of one or more pieces of cloth attached to a belt, sash, or band, they were fastened around the waist. Early on, men, like kings and priests, wore leopard skin or lion skin fastened across their shoulder. Later, these skins were replaced with fabric. Corselets were sleeveless, perhaps a decorative form of armor that was either strapless or suspended by small straps from the shoulders. The wrap skirt was a major garment for men throughout Egyptian history. Its length, width, and fit varied depending on the time period and the social class. Some use the term kilt for a wrapped dress. Variations of the wrap skirt. Early periods. Skirts were knee length or shorter in the earlier periods. They had a close fit around the hips. Some were even pleated or had a diagonal line across the front. In the Middle Kingdom, skirts were elongated, sometimes to the ankle. Shorter versions were worn to work or by soldiers or hunters. In the New Kingdom, skirts were either short and pleated or they were full and long with a close fit. Triangular decorative panels were also at the front. Sheath dresses were common amongst all classes of women. This garment is a closely fitted tube of fabric that starts above or below the breast and ends at the ankle. However, Vilja Singh Eastwood argued that because sheath dresses had not been found in any excavations, that sheath dresses was actually a wraparound dress with the shoulder straps as separate garments. Women's wrap dresses were draped and arranged differently than those of men. Loosely fitted tunics were worn by women of the lower classes. V-neck dresses, which began to appear during the Old Kingdom, is amongst one of the most common garments found in tombs. Costume components for men and women. Men's heads were typically clean shaven. However, their beards were worn as they were a symbol of maturity and authority. It was not common for women to shave their heads. Wigs were thought to be worn because they provided some level of comfort and convenience to the wearer, as well as to avoid getting head lice. Wigs varied in shape, length, and arrangement based on the time period. The styling of the wig could range from simple to long flowing locks to complex braiding, curls, or twists. Jewelry or jeweled belts provided the only source of color for New Kingdom gowns. Wide jeweled collars covered most of the chest. Other ornaments worn on the neck were pectorals and single amulets. Armlets, bracelets, and anklets were also worn. Egyptians applied aromatic skincare products to the skin. Men and women decorated their eyes, skin, and lips. Eye paint represented the eye of the god Horus and had a domestic, symbolic, and medicinal function. It was considered a powerful charm, the line around the eye, which helped to protect the eye against the glare of the sun. Costume components of children. Dress was minimal for the very young. Little boys were often naked with a bracelet or amulet worn on occasion until they started school. Little girls also went naked with necklaces, armlets, bracelets, and anklets, and sometimes earrings. Girls remained naked until they neared puberty. Pharaoh's children were distinguished by the lock of Horus or the lock of youth hairstyle that they wore. This was one lock of hair on the left side of the head, which was carefully arranged in braids over the ear. Costume for specialized occupations. Military dress. Foot soldiers wore short skirts. In the New Kingdom, an additional stiffened triangular panel can be seen worn at the front. Perhaps this was a means to protect the genitals. The helmet was made of padded leather. In some cases, the soldiers wore a corselet made of small plates of bone, metal, or leather that was affixed to a linen body and worn covering the chest. Most soldiers were barefoot. When the pharaoh dressed for war, his costume was typical of his era, with special insignia of his rank such as the blue war crown and false beard. Costume for specialized occupations, religious dress. Priests wore shaven heads. Their insignia was the real or faux leopard skin draped over the shoulders. All right, so this ties up chapters 1 and 2.